Chief Acevedo, why did you decide to join the protests on your own, just for you?
Well, I believe that to every cell in my body that, life's about relationships, and we are so radically dependent on one another. And, as soon as we all figure out that fact and actually acknowledge that fact and realize that we're all cousins, we go back enough in time in the history of humanity that we're really all part of the same race, the human race. And I just felt really compelled to be out there with the community and to actually feel the pain and actually took some of the brunt of the anger towards the police chief because my organization is not perfect. I'm not perfect. We've been talking about bad apples, and I was telling my team I've had to run out about 160 police officers in the last 3.5 years. So I said we need to stop talking about bad apples and say there's bad bushels out there. Even though the vast majority are still good, there's still a lot of bad people. But to actually be able to feel and see and hold and connect and actually hug strangers, it was something that I will take to the grave with me. And I think as a result of that connection, we fared a lot better than a lot of other cities. And also it set an example for our officers that, we're all part of the community and we need to mourn with the community. And sometimes, we need to listen to their anger and their pain, and I have no regrets. And by the way, I took off my mask. I've taken a lot of hits over that, but I felt like I needed to connect with people, and it's hard to do it with a lot of yelling and screaming and the mask on. And thank God I'm a person of faith, so I kept asking the good Lord for the Holy Spirit to cover me. And I just got my 4th COVID since the last major protest back negative. So we're doing okay.
Wonderful, wonderful. But I do want to ask you, what message do you have for other police and police leadership? What do you think it would take for other police chiefs to feel comfortable to join this type of dialogue?
Well, I think that a lot of my colleagues across the country, if they're asked, they're going to be part of the dialogue. They're going to be part of the conversation. They want to be part of the solution. I mean, part of the challenge, to be honest with you, is that, and I tweeted about this the other day, the average American police chief in big cities lasts about 3 years. And, it's people want perfection. There's no formula for 100% success 100% of the time. I mean, it's just, that's not what humans are not, that's just not in our nature. So what happens when you constantly have these chiefs leaving, sometimes they can't get involved because they're not there long enough. They know their own organization, let alone know their own community. And the problem with that is that, you end up having, I'll never forget having a vice president of the union in Austin PD, where I lasted 9.5 years, where he said, you know what, this is our house. Long after you're gone, I'll still be here. Now, I'm a pretty ornery guy. So when he told me that, I made it my goal to outlast him. And I did. He ended up retiring. I stayed there 9.5 years. But we have to have continuity of leadership and commitment to the leadership in order to affect change. You cannot change. You can't change organizational culture if you have a revolving chair, musical chairs with the police chief. Because ultimately, the people that stay behind that are the only constant is the labor, and that's not necessarily a good formula for success.
Okay, I understand. I understand that perspective. Right now, I'd like to ask if Professor Vitale or Professor Joseph have questions directly for you.
Sure, I'd be happy to ask one. Hi, Chief. Alex Vitale here. Grew up in Houston and been doing a lot of events down there. So, two of the really difficult issues you've had to deal with as chief have been recently the shooting of a young man who was having a mental health crisis, had a piece of rebar. There was body camera footage. And another, of course, was the drug raid that went badly, that ended up in the shooting of some of the officers, and some corruption issues were raised. And I'm wondering how you feel about the demand of this movement to politicians to take some of those things off the plate of the police department, that to really rethink why we have a police-centered approach to the drug war and why we've relied overwhelmingly on police to deal with mental health crisis calls.
Well, that's because we've failed to invest in in mental health and public education to the good extent. When we have this debate about defund the police, I like, in my community, I can tell you my community here in Houston, which is a minority majority community, if I try to close just one what we call storefront, oh my goodness, the people that we serve go crazy. They don't want less policing, they want better police, they want less bad policing. But why should they have to choose one or the other? We do need to invest in all of these services so police don't have to do it. But here's what worries me is that until we build that infrastructure and a support system, if there's a gap in between, we're going to go from bad to worse as it relates to the things that we're seeing in the streets. Like here in Houston, we have the Ed Emmett Center. About 68% of the total diversions by police of low-level misdemeanors that are in psychological distress, we don't even give them a criminal summons. We don't arrest them. We take them there. But what we find out is too often there's not enough wraparound services and ongoing services to try to stabilize these folks. But we're not giving up on them because we're hoping that to prevent violent crime by dealing with the underlying, what came first, the violence or the mental illness or the addiction? So we're completely support, Doc, building the infrastructure so we don't have to go. Now in Houston, let me just say this. We actually have mental health professionals at our communication center that Mayor Turner finally got us the permanent funding to actually divert calls where we don't even respond in the first place. So there's no crisis, so escalation when a guy shows up in a uniform like this, and we can actually get people help. We can counsel them on the line. We actually have our practitioners that go with us where the officer stands back in a polo shirt and the practitioner goes and makes the contact. So we're doing a lot of the right things. The challenge is we don't have enough of the funding for either our partners or our downstream service providers to be able to stabilize this. And let me just say this, that I mean from the bottom of my heart. When COVID-19 impacted the entire nation, north, south, east, west, rich, poor, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Christian, Muslim, atheist, whoever, all of a sudden the Congress printed about $3 trillion. Well, could you imagine if they had funded overnight $3 trillion to work on pre-K education, on high school education, on vocational education, on college programs for kids, on good drug treatment, on mental health treatment? Could you imagine how much better we'd be doing as a society? So if they could do it then, we need to figure out how they can do it moving forward for the communities that have been disenfranchised for far too long.
Thank you.
Hi, Chief. I support what you said, but I think we're in a society where we have to make choices. And especially since 1968, the choice we made was law and order over the beloved community. So right now, because we've made these choices for 52 years and built up this carceral state, I think that we're going to have less police drastically. So there are 800,000 police officers, 18,000 police precincts in the United States. And so the idea of shutting down some storefronts, whether it's in Houston or Austin, where I live, if those storefronts or police precincts were shut down and those people in those communities actually received the universal basic income, the children in those families had health care, they had employment, and they had social services, they're not going to miss law enforcement in those areas. One of the biggest things we've seen too is that David Brooks calls these people the weavers, but the grassroots violent disruptors who are from the communities, including places like Houston, places like New York City, where I grew up, in Chicago, who are doing this work. A lot of times they're not getting funded. If we funded that anti-violence work from people who are known in the community, that would be very transformative too when we think about restorative justice. So I do think we have choices to make. I think unfortunately, it's not this either or where we're gonna be able to get the same kind of funding that we've had for criminal justice and get that funding for investments in Black and brown communities. So we actually, when people say defund the police, they're saying that they want the majority of the funding that's actually now going to law enforcement that criminalizes and contains and segregates communities. They want that funding back into communities. New York City just announced that $1 billion from the police budget is going back into communities. So I do think we have to make real choices. And this is away from saying that all cops are bad or anything like that. They're caught up in this major system, but we have to make choices. And part of those choices means defund the police becomes the abolition movement of our time. And remember, during racial slavery, when you said abolition, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, they said those people were crazy. And the reason the Civil War was fought is because the Confederacy wanted slavery forever. And they said it. So when we say, hey, defund the police, it is the new human rights movement of our time. And I think we have to be honest about that, because it's going to make many people uncomfortable because they've been getting this funding that they're used to. And there's no way to continue this level of funding and to liberate these Black and brown communities across the United States.
Well, I don't disagree with what you said, but I think it's also about, you know, if we can't tear down a building that we're using until we build the next stadium, because what do you do in the interim? So I think we just have to be thoughtful. And I would just urge policymakers, because, you know, you're in Austin, and I used to call the community, this, it seemed like it was always the same people coming to City Hall that they'd be saying the community this and the community that. Then when you really, I call them the community of 10 because it's always the same people. And then when you go ask where they live, they didn't even live in Austin. They were just in Austin City Hall acting like they knew. I would just say that it's really important that we get buy-in from the people that we're wanting to help the most. And we actually, I know you know Chaz Moore and from the Austin Justice Coalition and Mimi, and you know I love working with those young activists. And I remember when Chaz, we actually got I can't remember who it was out of Chicago, what outfit, to fund them to actually go do door-to-door surveying in East Austin and what's left of the Black community and the brown community in Austin, especially the African American community, because of gentrification. A lot of the folks have had to move out. He could not believe, and you can ask Chaz himself, he could not believe just how much support there was for good policing and what their expectations were. So I think that I think, Doc, that if we're smart about it and we all are part of the conversation, just like, I'll be honest with you, the war on drugs, you know, we treat people that have an addiction like they're hardcore criminals, you know, like they're violent criminals. You know, there's so much that needs to be done that's not being done. Why are we arresting people with like on New Year's Eve when I was working patrol here with Senator John Whitmire? He goes out on patrol with me every New Year's Eve, and we arrest this young man, probably in his mid-30s. He has a rock. Okay, he's in his work uniform. It's New Year's Eve. As he gets out of the car, it was brand new here. I've only been here a month. He chucks the rock. The young officers, I didn't know how to even get out of the office. That's how new I was to Houston. He spots it. He picks it up. Oh, he's so proud. He's got his new chief. I go into the car. The guy's in his work uniform. I look at it. I go in his car because we can't leave the car there because there's a good chance it might be on blocks if we left it there. So it has to be impounded. And then I look at this. He's got the beautiful picture of just a really beautiful young man, probably about 8 or 9 years old. And I looked at Whitmire and I said, how have we made society safer by taking this guy to jail tonight for the felony possession of the rock instead of giving him an appointment to go see a counselor? Because what I know, he's working, he's employed. So I know even if he has an addiction, it's under control because he's actually working. But instead, we arrest him, we take his car. Now he's there for the weekend, if not for a week, until he can post bail, which he shouldn't have to post bail because, again, it's about risk assessment. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done that we're not doing. And I think that sometimes we go in so many directions that the low-hanging fruit like that case is not being addressed.
I'd like to ask a couple questions while we have Chief with us. Chief, while you're with us today, you're really the representative of the police force, even though we know that you have a lot of progressive ways of thinking about the role of the police. But while we have you, I'd like to ask a bit about the question of police culture, because that kind of confuses a lot of people who aren't police. What is fundamental police culture? Is there a way that can be addressed while we're trying to work on new ways of the community thinking about the police? But what about the police themselves? Is there a way to address that? I mean, what would you even call police culture? And if we were going to try to quote unquote demilitarize the police, how does that affect the police themselves?
Well, let me just say that neighborhoods have culture, or all organizations have culture. I think that when it comes to policing, here's the problem that I see with policing. We have way too many police departments. So Doc talked about 18,000 police departments, 800,000 police officers. The problem is that a lot of departments talk a good game as it relates to accountability, but then when you look at what they actually tolerate, like in our department, when you come to Houston and visit, ask any officer at Houston PD, if you lie with the Houston Police Department, if you're caught lying in terms of your work, what are the consequences? And I put out a video that I got here. If you lie, you die, which means if you have a sustained misconduct for lying, you end up getting fired. But here's the problem. How many departments they set the standard, right? In terms of if you lie, you die, and guess what? But then they don't enforce the bar. So I think that the biggest problem with policing is not necessarily the cops in the front end, because as although we have so many problems today, I'm 55. I'm an immigrant. I grew up in LA, and I can just say that in the last 34 years, policing has come a long way, and in a lot of ways, we've come further than society because we have a zero tolerance. I mean, if you see what goes on social media and all the hate, just follow my Twitter account. You're going to see a lot of hate. We've run out 4 or 5 officers in the last couple of months because they've shown their ugly heads. So I think in a lot of ways we're ahead of society. But I think the biggest problem in American policing is leadership. It's police chiefs that tolerate, give people a second chance. Like David Joseph, I don't know, Doc, if you're there, David Joseph, African-American young man, 17 years of age, totally naked, broad daylight. An officer shows up, Jeffrey Freeman, sees him standing in the middle of the street, gets out of the car with his gun in his hand. And here's the problem. I think biggest problem with policing is that too often people that have shown they have no business remaining on the force, guess what happens? We keep them. And we keep them until they act in such an egregious manner that now you have no choice but to fire him. But by that time, they've done so much harm. If we created a culture of accountability across all 18,000 police departments, where the bar is set high, but then you enforce the standard, you'd see officers, because officers are they're going to, by and large, not all, because we got knuckle draggers, are going to rise to the level of expectation that we set, but we have to enforce the standard. I mean, we can't even use Brady in Texas, Brady versus Maryland, where you have to let the defense know about, certain discipline, right? In law enforcement, we can't even use the fact that an officer's on the Brady list to fire them in Texas. That's a problem. So we're going to need the help of other sectors, including elected officials, to affect greater change.
And what about a reward system? That to me just seems part of what might happen in general when you want better behavior, is to reward better behavior, not just punish bad behavior, but with either promotions, commendations, raises in pay. That was just something that I was thinking of, that as we're talking about a way to begin to modify police culture, that might be something to consider, would be rewards.
Yes.
For the type of behavior that we, the community, and the leadership would want.
Absolutely. I think that we've got 6,300 employees here, and every single commendation, whether it's just a regular memorandum of commendation, they all come through my desk, so I can actually write a note on every single one. Now, it takes a lot of work, but it's really interesting that the feedback you get is that means more. And so what I always tell my community, listen, let us help hold the bad cops accountable, the bushels of bad cops accountable. Let us help us get those bad apples out, or that bushels of bad apples out. But by the same token, help us lift up the good police officers. And so it is important to reward to acknowledge. And for us, one of the things that we're working on now is that, the truth is that for every bad outcome in terms of those people in psychological distress, where you have a shooting like the Mr. Chavez's shooting here, we have a lot in between where they go right. We want to start giving actual awards here. We're developing it now for life-saving in terms of a situation where deadly force may have been authorized under the law, but our officers did all the right things in terms of de-escalation and creating distance, taking time to come up with a good plan, using cover and concealment, and having sufficient resources on scene. We want to start capturing those instances and rewarding those instances so our officers realize that the good behavior is being appreciated and being acknowledged. Let me just also say that on our department, we always have our award ceremony on a bi-monthly, quarterly basis, and we invite the families because we want to celebrate excellence because we want people to emulate it, and hopefully it spreads.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else in the panel have a question for Chief?
I do. I have a comment and a question. Hi.
Hi.
So earlier you had mentioned that, there's this conversation about removing, you use the term storefronts. Removing these storefronts from communities, and that communities want this. And that it seems like there's this fear of that gap space. What will happen if we remove police from these neighborhoods, and then at the same time haven't added in, these social supports that folks need? And for me, working, in an organization that works with folks that are experiencing domestic violence, one of our safety assessment toolkits is looking at unemployment, looking at drug use and dependence, to have an understanding. It doesn't determine that someone is going to be an abuser, but it does have relevance, especially when you look at statistical data. So we do know that having those social supports does decrease the likelihood that someone is going to be violent in their home. But then also, I think there's this misunderstanding that, and let's just look at domestic violence specifically, that if you remove police, then folks will not be safe. But in my experience, in my professional experience, what I've seen is that police are often so untrained, and often are unable to really respond in the ways that are necessary due to their own protocol, that it's not actually that much more helpful in a lot of situations to have police present. So for example, someone might say, but if we don't have police in my neighborhood and I call, how will I get help when this person's abusing me? Well, for one, if you live in a neighborhood where police don't come for 3 hours, it's not really very helpful anyway if you call, or even if they do arrive, but the person has already left, or if they have arrested the person. But for those of us who work in the criminal justice system, we know that oftentimes the person gets arrested, they're arraigned, and then they're released. And then they say, oh, well, we'll give you an order of protection. Call us again if he comes back or she comes back, whoever comes back. And we do this again and again until there's actually some court proceedings that go on. And so in that way, it's like folks have this idea that as long as police are here, we're safe. But in reality, there are so many ways that this can go for an individual that, to think that keeping officers in this community is going to mean that something's going to get done about the violence you're experiencing is really just not necessarily the case.
Well, thanks for your work with domestic violence. We've been pushing to get the Violence Against Women's Act completely reauthorized, and we're still not there, but we're not going to stop pushing. But the truth is that the biggest problem with criminal justice is that there's a focus on the policing part of it, but we're just one cog.
Right.
Look at what's going on with DA's offices, with the judges, with probation, with parole, with the juvenile, hall, with all the other pieces of it. Because I can tell you that what you just mentioned about somebody that happened here more than once. One of our biggest drivers for homicides, a significant driver, is domestic violence. And you're right. People that are really violent sometimes go in one door and out the other and end up coming back and killing their partner. And so I hope that as we continue these conversations that, we want to be, I don't mind being under the spotlight, because when you're under the spotlight, it makes you be better. But it can't just be the police. We have got to have the rest of the system has to be under the spotlight, from the judges to the prosecutors to the public defender's office to probation, parole, and all the different cogs. Otherwise, we'll never be able to truly be as effective as we can to keep the public safe. But I think that part of what you're saying is absolutely right. The police can't do it alone, and we're just but one cog in that wheel.
Right. And so in thinking about like a solution, we do have, advocates here in New York City that work in police precincts and work with officers, especially on DV calls, and can come with DV officers, to check on someone who has a history of domestic violence, in their home. And one thing that could be better is appreciating the knowledge that these other organizations are coming with, because it's like, it's not enough just to have these folks in the precinct if the only way that these officers are really getting trained is just a quick 10-minute little tutorial on how to work with someone. And it's not enough if you bring this person along, you just put them in a vest, and basically the police are making all the decisions on how we're going to handle this, and you just come in and talk. It's like we have to appreciate the knowledge that everyone is coming with and work together, where we say, if we feel that keeping police around in this situation is the option, to say, what do you think is the best way to go about this?
Well, I hope that whoever, if you work out of a station, I hope that they're smart enough to let our partners that are trained in dealing with these societal issues and these issues that can be very volatile. The officers should only, if you're there, they should really be there only for safety, and that's it. They should let you take lead and listening to you. I have a feeling that you're probably extremely effective. And I can tell you that here in Houston, with the Houston Area Women's Center, we do a lot of work with our partners. And when we take our practitioners with us, the officer takes a back seat because we want to let the subject matter expert take the lead. Let me just close with this. I have to go. Everybody's mentioned training. Training is really important. Unfortunately, too often, the Department of Justice, too many chiefs wanted them to get rid of the pattern and practice investigations that Justice was doing with the Obama administration. And I was one of the few that was against getting rid of it because, quite frankly, too many elected officials don't want to invest in proper training for people. If you look at other nations, there's a lot of nations in the free world. Police officers go to a 4-year academy, a 2-year academy, not 4 to 6 months like we do here. And so we've got to rethink and reinvent policing as we move forward. But we also have to look at the different systems, including our private sector partners, and what role they can play so we can take a backseat to some of these things.
Well, we appreciate your time today, Chief. We know you're busy, so thanks a lot for joining us today. We're going to continue the discussion with those that we have on the panel, and you will go ahead and get back to the important work that you're doing today.
Thank you all. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.